As France tries to determine the link between the shooting of 3 Jewish children and a rabbi on Monday and before that 3 French paratroopers, we ask what are the root causes behind such attacks and to what extent do politics instigate them? This is Inside Story. Hello and a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. The shooting of 7 people in the southern cities of Toulouse and Montauban has shaken France. And with presidential elections just a few weeks away, how will the killings make a difference on the campaign trail? Jamal El-Shayal has this report.
Campaigning on hold, at least for the moment. Leading French presidential candidates waste no time in visiting the scene of Monday's attack. But there are those who feel the tone of recent campaigning may have played a part in the unfortunate events.
We've been seeing over the past few years virulent and racist speeches from our politicians, which were held in total impunity. So of course, those kinds of speeches are always preparing for such vile acts like those we've seen.
One such controversy was sparked by this woman, Marine Le Pen. She is running for the right-wing anti-immigration National Front Party. She recently made the sensationalist but inaccurate claim that all meat now sold in Paris was halal, slaughtered in the Muslim way. Conscious that her comments would resonate with right-leaning voters, Nicolas Sarkozy swiftly made an unplanned visit to a local meat market. He called for all kosher and halal products to be labelled. His prime minister further inflamed tensions.
In a modern country, there are ancestral traditions that don't really correspond to anything anymore, when in the past they were there because of hygiene problems.
And last week, Sarkozy spoke of how integration is no longer working in France, a move seen as a deliberate effort to woo the right.
He was very successful in 2007 when he basically came in on a very strongly right-wing platform. He's trying to do this again. He has brought halal food to the forefront. He's vowing to cut immigration in 2. He's now saying that he wants to limit or at least review the Schengen agreement on free circulation of people. So he's definitely going on the Le Pen territory.
And his efforts to win over the right appear to have paid off, at least in the polls where he leads. But since the halal kosher meat debate and Sarkozy's anti-immigration comments, 7 people have been killed and the public's concerns have changed. Consequently, so has the president's tone.
We must be united. We must not give in to the discrimination nor revenge. In the face of such an event, France can only be strong if there is a national unity. We owe it to the victims of these cold-blooded assassinations. We owe it to our country.
Le Pen, however, had a different take, claiming the attacks were a result of France's mistaken policy.
The risk of fundamentalism has been underestimated in our country. Certain political and religious groups are developing in the face of a certain laxness.
In such a politically charged environment, in a country with social, religious and racial tensions, many are posing the question, is the Toulouse serial killer a product of these fault lines? And how far are politicians exploiting these issues? Jamal El-Shayal, Inside Story.
OK, well, let's explore what links might exist between these attacks and the broader issue of racism in Europe, as well as the way politicians play into it. Our 3 guests here today to discuss it are, in Paris, political commentator Franck Guillory. He's also deputy editor of Joel Press, France's first e-magazine of international news. In London, Jeremy Corbyn, a British Member of Parliament with the Labour Party. And in Brussels, Chibo Onyeji, president of the European Network Against Racism, or ENAR. Frank, if I could start with you to get an idea of the mood in France at the moment. Are we getting a sense of national unity or one of anger?
I think there's certainly a sense of national unity. There's also a sense of misunderstanding. I don't think that the French people are still realizing exactly what happened, what is happening, and obviously, I mean, the investigation is still underway, and we still need to know exactly which were the motives behind the 7 murders. But there's clearly a sense of some sort of standby for the moment. Not only the French presidential campaign is on halt, but also you really think among the population that people are now wondering, okay, what's next? What should we make of it? What does this mean for France?
Indeed, certainly a lot of questions still to be answered about the attack itself. We have seen 2 politicians coming out giving very different reactions. First of all, let's look at President Sarkozy's reaction, one of calling for national unity, appealing for the French people not to give in to feelings of vengeance. Was this the sort of tone that you expected following this attack?
Well, you know, after weeks of campaigning, President Sarkozy has put back his presidential coat and tried to appear as the father of the nation, who's here to safeguard national unity. So he's playing his role, and it's natural. The other thing also is that there's no such thing as communities, if you want, under the French Republic. There's one and one only community, which is the national community, which is the Republic itself. So anything that actually separate any group of the population for religious or any other motives actually is, from a theoretical point of view, unacceptable. You know, we're just all French citizens, and that's how we have to treat this question.
OK, Jeremy, if we could move over to you. As we heard there, Sarkozy clearly being a president at this time rather than a presidential candidate. Would you say that this has been a distinct change in tone from what we've heard in recent weeks?
Well, it's a very welcome change from the language he used as Minister of the Interior and much the language he's used as President and in the run-up to this campaign. He's joined in a chorus that's saying multiculturalism has failed. He's been very tough against immigration. He's announced that there's too many immigrants in France. He's hardly presented himself as the leader of what is, like most other countries in Europe, certainly my own, a multi-faith, multicultural, multi-ethnic society. He doesn't present that image at all from France, and I think it is very sad and very disappointing and, from him, deeply irresponsible.
Franck Guillory, would you agree with that assessment of Sarkozy?
Well, yes, the thing is that there's one thing. It's true that France is a multicultural, multi-ethnic and multi-faith country, undoubtedly, I mean. But at the same time, we still have something which should prevent us from any form of disintegration, if you want. I mean, the word is a bit too strong, but there's something, it's a failure of the Republican model. You know, it's the fact that, above all, before being a Muslim or before being a Protestant or a Catholic, we are French and we are French citizens. And that's what has failed over the past decades. That's the inability of most of our politicians to actually speak for France and to remind people of the amazing heritage that we got from the French Revolution and from 2 centuries of republicanism.
Chibo Onyeji, I want to bring you in here because you're looking Europe-wide. Indeed, your organisation has just released a report looking at racism across Europe. It's indeed found that in the political context, in terms of racism, the situation was worsening. Do you agree with this idea that politicians do ascribe to an idea of national identity, or do they fuel the fires of racism?
First of all, the fact that President Sarkozy is toning down his anti-immigration rhetoric at this time of elections is very interesting. But what is more important here is that Europe, not just France, should take these individual national developments as important symbols. We know what happened in Oslo in the summer, and this has happened just the other day in France. So let us not look at it as individual happenings in individual countries. There is a wave in Europe, and this is what INAR and other anti-racism organizations across Europe have been talking about all over the years. Europe and European leaders have to sit up to the challenge of addressing this monster and not wait until something happens and we use them as opportunities to make political gains.
Jeremy, I can see you agreeing there. If you could expand from your point of view on this apparent rise in racism across Europe.
Well, the figures that Einar and others have produced over the last few months are truly frightening. The deaths in Oslo were awful, but they weren't the only ones. There's been the death of individual Roma people, there's been murders of individuals, there's been attacks on anti-racist campaigners, and there's been a sort of rising rhetoric by centre-right politicians all across Europe about multiculturalism having failed. David Cameron got into that, as did Angela Merkel and Sarkozy, and then there's the claim that somehow or other Europe is full and can't take any more immigration, and then there was the halting of people travelling freely from Italy into France, the suspension of the Schengen Agreement, and then the burqa ban and the headgear argument in France. And I think that Europe has just got to recognise that we are multi-faith, we are multicultural, and that there is nothing weakening about a society that glories in the diversity of its faiths or its backgrounds. There's actually a great strengthening in that. And I think one of the good things that happened in Britain in the 1960s was the then government passed the Race Relations Act, which set a benchmark, which has been one of essentially development of a multicultural society in Britain, where there is self-identification by those communities. And I think that actually is, generally speaking, the right way to go. We do have our problems here as well. We have the English Defence League, the equivalent of the Nazi brown shirts in their behaviour. We have the British National Party, a deeply intolerant organisation. But we also have, as every other country does, very strong, very committed anti-racist campaigners that do stand up and defend minority communities and do stand up and defend diversity in our society.
Frank, it is true, isn't it? We have seen Sarkozy appealing to the far right to try and draw in voters that might otherwise be voting for Marine Le Pen.
No, it's true, but there's one thing I'm not sure I clearly understand. I mean, this is a very interesting debate about fueling racism in Europe, and I agree mostly with what Jeremy said, for example. But if we're talking about what happened in Toulouse on Montauban, we're talking about something completely different. We thought yesterday that the murderer, the gunman, could possibly be a psychopath or a neo-Nazi, a French version of Anders Behring Breivik. But that's actually, if I believe what we are told at the moment right now when I'm speaking, that's not exactly the case. We're given to believe that this guy is a 24-year-old French guy who is of Muslim faith. So actually, that is the truth. Is that if he's a murderer, this 24-year-old guy, actually a Muslim, supporting the Salafists, killed 3 Muslims. French soldiers in Montauban, and then carried on with killing 4 Jewish French citizens. That is the truth. So it is not about French politicians playing the racial card during French presidential election. It's about a problem which we find very difficult to address, which is the fact that inside the Muslim community here in France and obviously in Britain, remember the debate at the time of 7/7, there's a minority, 0.1% probably, of this Muslim, a member of the Muslim community, which actually turned into terrorists, homegrown terrorists. We had a debate in London, in Britain, after 7/7. That's actually what France is facing now. The fact that our French system, Republican model, has failed, and that members of our community, born in France, who grew up in France, decided to turn their back to the very core values of what makes us, France and the Western world, and decided to fight against their own people.
OK, Chibo Onyeji, how would you respond to that? I mean, it's a fair point, is it? Is it right to correlate this attack in France with that in Norway?
No, look, he's missing the point. Now, it doesn't matter how you kill somebody. It doesn't matter how you commit terrorism in Europe or in the European Union. What matters is that you commit terrorism. The fact of the matter is this: whether you are of the far right or Al-Qaeda or whatever, we know that the rhetoric of the far right is anti-Islam. We know that the rhetoric of the far right is anti-migration, is xenophobic, and all that. Could we not possibly see this as a kind of reaction to this kind of politics? So it doesn't make any sense. There's not much point in trying to argue the issue from the point of view of my colleague, who was saying that, well, this is not the same thing. Murder is murder. It doesn't matter how you commit it. So I think what Europe needs to do, and our report makes it clear, what Europe needs to do is to rethink its strategy in dealing with migration and people of third country origin. That is it. We need to figure out, policymakers and politicians need to figure out a way of toning down all this rhetoric that exacerbate these developments.
Jeremy, it is true, isn't it, that this man's actions, if you do look at it in that response, could be the product themselves of racism, in that he has been felt perhaps marginalised in France for much of his time there?
After July the 7th, 2007 in London, it's true, the murder was dreadful, the murders were dreadful, and indeed a number of those that died came from the area that I represent in Parliament, and there was a debate. The most powerful statement made at that time was by the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who said he would not allow this atrocity to divide London's communities and drive people apart. And he headed up a campaign of recognition and unity, recognition of all the diversity of London, unity of all the people of London. And that was a very, very powerful message. And I think it's that sort of message that we have to get across. Obviously, the killings in Toulouse are dreadful. The killings of the Jewish children or the Muslim soldiers is dreadful. The murder of all those young people in Norway is absolutely dreadful. There is a narrative of far-right extremism across Europe that has to be countered. There is also a very small number, fortunately, of people that have different backgrounds who feel that somehow or other they have a right or a cause to go off and commit terrible acts. I think you defeat those by involving and bringing in those communities, and don't use the rhetoric that somehow or other Islam doesn't belong to Europe, somehow or other Buddhism, Hinduism or any other faith doesn't belong to Europe. Europe needs to make itself the home of tolerance and the home of multi-faith living. And I don't fully understand this narrative that says everyone that comes to Europe or has many cases born or grown up in Europe has to Europeanize themselves. Europe should be the home of diversity. That is the strength of our continent, not the weakness.
OK. Franck Guillory, if we can just look forward now, how do you think Sarkozy is going to respond to this as the elections grow ever closer, as we get back on the campaign trail? Do you think we're going to see a distinct change in tone?
Well, actually, I do agree with Jeremy and Chibo in Brussels, but that fact that what these murders in Montauban and Toulouse says is that now France is finally facing this challenge that Britain faced after 7/7, rightly so. But France thought for a very long time that we were prevented from having to address these issues and that we were not concerned by such a challenge. The situation now and the difficulty for all French politicians is to make sure that these murders are not used to bring one community against another, But at the same time, I still believe that the truth has to be said, and that if it's true that this guy in Toulouse is responsible for the murder, we've got also to address this issue of how it is possible that this guy turned to such fanaticism. And it's not by not saying this, by turning a blind eye on the truth, that we will solve the problem. France is facing a terrible challenge at this moment in time, and that's what obviously will be the topic in the coming weeks for the French presidential election.
Back in 2010, I've got a statistic here that 12% of French voters chose the National Front. What percentage do you think we're likely to see this time round?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Marine Le Pen is very high in the polls, and I do hope personally that she will be as low as possible. But, that is not because of the what happened in Toulouse, that people will vote for Marine Le Pen. That is, if they feel that politicians let them think that actually that's all Muslims which are responsible. Not all Muslims are responsible for what happened in Toulouse. That's one very specific guy who decided to turn his back to all the values that makes France France.
Chibo Onyeji, how do you think Sarkozy, how can the French leaders assure Muslim communities in France and indeed across Europe that they're not targeting Muslims, that they are targeting one man, that the Muslim community as a whole does not feel marginalised?
Well, there is something we need to understand here. There are two things happening. Number one, the idea of national identity in Europe is passé. On the other hand, there is a tendency that is picking up momentum, and this is multiculturalism. The moment Europe stops to take account of this and embrace this multiculturalism and begin to realize that different nationalities, different people can live together within the same Europe, the problems will begin to be addressed realistically. And this is the thing, I think, that we need to be aware of.
Why is it so difficult for multiculturalism to exist in Europe?
Well, it is difficult because there are different notions about the so-called national identity that posits the position that there are certain people who cannot fit into our society. This is not true. There are certain people who cannot have the same liberal way of life. This is not true. I mean, if you examine the different cultures that people bring along with them in Europe, you will see that there are areas in which we can find common ground. The problem is in the utter denial of the possibility of coexistence. We don't teach our children in schools things that will lead to this coexistence. We think that Europe has the only culture that is that can be practiced, but that's not quite true. Yes, of course, we are living in Europe, but we have to brace up to the fact that there is a new trend taking place, and we need to begin to address this reality.
Franck Guillory, how do you think Sarkozy is going to counter a rise in feelings of xenophobia, feelings that may well stem from this attack?
Well, you know, the way he will try to counter this rise is by doing, for example, what he did this morning, what he did and that any other president in his position would have done, which is to meet with the leaders of the Muslim community in France, with the head of the Paris Mosque and also with the head of the Jewish communities in France. Because contrary to what your guest was saying from Brussels, the Muslim people and the leaders of the Muslim community in France don't want, they consider that they are French above all, you know, and that yes, they want to practice their faith freely, but they consider that they are French above all because that's the way we've done things in France for ages. And that's because the feeling of what it means to be French has been undermined over the past decades by through the educational system, the failure of the educational system, or various other things, that things are now not working that well. But there will be a march organized on Sunday in Paris, joint march organized by the Jewish and Muslim communities, and they will just say one thing: we are French. Before anything else, we are French.
OK, well, certainly changes things in the run-up to the presidential elections in a few months' time. Very interesting discussion to have today. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us in Paris, Franck Guillory, in London, Jeremy Corbyn, and in Brussels, Chibo Onyeji. And thanks very much to you two for watching this edition of Inside Story. Any comments or suggestions, do drop us an email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.